Well, welcome everybody to the New York Academy of Art Spring Lecture Series. We're really lucky today to have Rona Pondick and Robert Feintuch joining us. I've been joking with them for the past couple of minutes because I've known them for 30 years. So it's a double pleasure to have you guys here. And as I said earlier, if I were to show your entire CVs, we would be here all day. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction to both artists. Rona and Robert are extremely accomplished artists. Since 1984, Rona's had over 48 solo exhibitions of her work in museums and galleries internationally, including the Galleria d'Arte Moderna in Bologna, Italy, the Groninger Museum in Groningen, Netherlands, the Rupertinum in Salzburg, Austria, Cincinnati Art Museum, the Worcester Art Museum, DeCordova Museum, Cranbrook Art Museum, and the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, amongst many more. Her work is in the collections of many institutions worldwide, including the Whitney Museum of Art, the Met, the Morgan Library and Museum, Brooklyn Museum of Art, Philadelphia Museum of Art, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and a Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. Robert's also had a crazy number of solo exhibitions, including at Daniel Newberg Gallery, CRG Gallery, Sonnabend Gallery, Howard Yezerski Gallery, Betty Cunningham Gallery, the Utah Museum of Art, and the Bates Museum of Art. His work has been written about in The Observer, the Boston Globe, Harper's Bazaar, the Brooklyn Rail, Art News, Art in America, and many, many more. So thank you both for joining us today. I also want to thank Noel Timmons for setting all this up. The three of us are old, and so we have struggles with our technology, but Noel made it possible for this all to work out for us. So I'm going to start out with a couple of questions. First of all, just very simply, how did you meet and how did your work factor into your respect for each other? I mean, I think, Robert, you were a minimalist when you first met Rona, and she may have thought you were cute, but a minimalist, really? What's going on here?
Rona, should I tell the story about how we met? Because that's a funny story. I mean, Rona was a year behind me in graduate school, and I crashed the party for incoming students, which was in the president's backyard, and all the art students were within 15 minutes drunk in the backyard, and I smelled pot in the bushes and walked back, and Rona and her closest friend at the time were smoking pot in the bushes, and that's how we met. We moved in together 2 weeks later.
Oh my God, like speed dating.
And lived together since then. But you know, we were at school at the height of formalism and abstraction, and both of us, you know, were strongly affected by that. I mean, when I met Rona, her work was pretty abstract. And I had gone to Cooper Union, and so, you know, I was trying to work like an abstract expressionist and alternating between figuration and abstraction there. And then at Yale, for me, I encountered, you know, geometric abstraction and sort of reductive abstract work. And I was very, very strongly affected by it. I don't know, Rona, how would you describe what you were
doing or going through then?
Yeah, I mean, I'm also interested just, you know, if you were both working, you know, non-objectively, when did, you know, imagery, when did the figure start to enter into your work? Was that much, much later?
No, for me, it was a sort of slow walk my first year in graduate school towards the second year, where I started drawing from my own body, but the fragment, I would do like hand drawings, foot drawings, never the head. I don't know why, I can't even tell you. So I started the second year I was in school. I kind of started to realize that as much as I loved post-minimalism, and there were attributes of post-minimalism that I'm still knocked out by, how physical and strong a presence it has, and a gestalt. When you walk into a space, you can grasp it immediately. I just realized it wasn't what I was interested in, but I didn't know what I was interested in. And when I got out of graduate school and Robert and I both came back to New York, I started drawing from the Met, at the Met. And I was drawing to try to understand what I was gravitating towards with utter love and what I hated. So I was drawing from both ends of the spectrum, trying to understand what my own roots were.
Well, do you feel that the educational environment that you were in, you're both at Yale, did you feel like it would have been too difficult to pursue that at that time at Yale? Would there have been resistance to it, or would you just have, had to find your own way?
It's interesting. I think the painting department was incredibly different than the sculpture department. At the time, the sculpture department was minuscule in size. We had a total of 12 students, first year, second year, and that was it. And David von Schlegel was a very odd person who ran the department. He had keys to everybody's studio, and he would look, but he would look when you weren't there. And then you'd kind of run into each other in the hallway, and he would start chatting with you about your work, but not in your room, not in your studio. But he was fiercely supportive. And so he, during crits, rarely would be critical. He'd be critical in the hallway when you were chatting one-on-one, but not at a group crit.
Huh. Yeah, they refer to it as a mosh pit now. So that kind of public kind of deconstructing of the artist seems to be the norm there, or at least it was. Robert, how about you? Was that true in the painting department?
When I applied to Yale, I applied with figurative paintings. My slide application was figurative paintings, and then they asked you to submit actual physical paintings. You had to rent a truck and get them up there. And though by that time I was making abstract paintings, and that's what I submitted. And the department had, it was sort of split. I think abstraction was dominant in certain ways, but Bill Bailey was there. I mean, even John Walker, who was there, had figurative references in his work. Al Held was very much dominant there, I think. And so this is with hindsight. To me, it seems like there were acceptable modes to work within there, but each of those modes had limitations. I'm getting older, and so I have a lot more hindsight than I ever planned to have. And there were things that I absolutely believed with absolute conviction while I was there. Some of them very new to me, and with even moral conviction practically, that now seem preposterous to me, 40 or 50 years later. But that's not only true there, it's across time that stuff like that happens. But so there were figurative painters there. And one of the good things about being in the department was my friendships didn't seem ideological then. I was, even though I was making really reductive paintings, a painter named Ed Rath, who was making work that seemed sort of Chicago-ish in some ways and figurative, is who pointed me towards some of the people I was very interested in then. People looked broadly there, it seemed like. So.
Well, that's always struck me as strange that Bailey and Held were there at the same time, but maybe that's really what you needed to have that kind of discourse happening. You have to have the polar opposites.
And like Rona, I began to work figuratively as soon as I got out of graduate school. But because of the larger world, in some ways, it did seem pretty forbidden in the larger world.
But we became each other's world.
What do you mean by that, Rona?
We are our closest friends, and we're painfully honest with each other about each other's work. And that honesty is both wonderful and awful at times, because it can cut really deep. because we really are honest with each other. And we would also, when we were not working, always want to do the same thing, which is go to museums and travel and look at art together. And we would literally split our days, half painting, half sculpture. And we kind of educated each other about each other's interests, loves, what we gravitated towards, what we didn't, why. So I'm as comfortable looking at painting as I think Robert is looking at sculpture.
Well, can you talk a little bit about that? Like, even without like diving too deeply into this, but how do you approach each other's work? If somebody's, turned a corner that looks like it's not going to be productive, or may even take, some tributary that just doesn't seem promising, how do you address it? I mean, you say you're honest, but you're obviously trying to preserve your relationship too. So I'd imagine it'd be a pretty fine line.
No, we kind of cut to it pretty quick. That's pretty terrible, or that sucks. Or why are you driving yourself crazy? This is finished and you're just running after your own tail here. We've both stopped each other at times where we're very happy we stopped each other, because sometimes you get so obsessed, you don't see what's in front of you.
Oh,
or at least I don't.
Yeah.
At the same time, again, with this hindsight thing, I'm aware I've been wrong about a lot of stuff across the years, and even in my own work at times wrong about directions that I thought were useless turned out to be really productive across the long term, or stuff like that. So I don't think we tend to tell each other that's not going to be productive. I think we.
Yeah, that's not how we speak to each other.
Yeah, it's more like, this part seems off to me, or let's see what happens next, and that kind of thing. But our studios were in the same space for more than 30 years with just one wall between them. Then you had to walk through mine to get to Rona's. So there was a lot of back and forth. And although I don't think we thought for years that our work was closely related in any way, and until we did that show together, until we got asked to do that show together.
Well, let me ask you a couple of questions about that, because that is very interesting to me. In some ways, your work is so different from each other, but in other ways that you use similar kinds of motifs. You've both used yourselves in your work. You've used yourselves in very different ways. And I never thought of them as self-portraiture, but I wonder if there's any truth in that. I mean, do you see the works that use you as a central icon as having an element of self-portraiture in it?
I don't. I look at me using my body the way a dancer does. That it's a tool. It's my head, and I've used, one head since 1998, but I change it by either remodeling parts of it, or changing the scale of it, or removing my ears, or removing my hair, or, I do a million different things to it.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting for me to just see, using certain parts of my body that I have been using since 1998, how for me it still feels fresh. It doesn't feel old. But it's still it's all deriving from this one head.
You've never rescanned yourself. You're using the same.
I didn't scan myself. So I had a crazy process. I had two friends that I trust. And they coated me with medical silicone. We didn't put straws in my nose, so if there was a bubble, I would have died. I was encased, rubber, sheeting, then the plaster for 2.5 hours.
Oh, God.
And it's a good thing I had a pad of paper with a pen, because at a certain point I started choking, and, slit, choking, And then at the end, get this fucking thing off of me. And I never wanted to do it ever, ever again.
But now you've taken that same, I'm going to jump
So
ahead.
so that head, I then plastically removed its hair. And I decided I wanted to then scan it. And when you do scans, you get your best scans with information when it's white and opaque.
Okay.
And I was looking for the highest resolution possible. And I was lucky we had friends that were scientists at Stanford, and they hooked me up with the military in Canada, who was doing really the most amazing scanning back in '98. So the files were huge. Took a year for us to first get the scan, and because it was always crashing, and then to output it. Once I output it, which was essentially like a wax, I would make molds off of it and then make a master. But I could keep, so I took the head and I had it built every size down to 1/4 of an inch, and then went bigger. These are my prototypes. I have like 16 different sizes. And then I have like, cast maybe 30 of them of each. And I start from it, and then I start moving away by modeling and remaking it, and then making a mold of it. So it goes through all these crazy mutations.
So why don't you screen share, and then I'll ask some specific questions of you, and then we'll go back to Robert and he can screen share from his website. Because I have some very specific questions about casting.
What would you?
Well, here's, actually, if you go back to the head there.
Hold on. This is just going to keep flashing, unfortunately. Okay. Do you want a metal head or a resin?
Yeah, let's start with the metal head. And one of the things that was interesting for me in watching the development of your work was seeing how, as this body of work developed, it felt like there was a level of beauty in the work that felt new to me. And that may not be how you would view it, but I felt like the craftsmanship, the materials had a kind of seduction to it that was really invested in the aesthetics of the object. And first of all, I wonder if that's, for you, an accurate understanding of the work, and why you made that decision to switch the materials to work with this hybridization of the animal and yourself, your head and hands.
So I'm just going to show you. So before I was doing the hybrid pieces, I want to just go back for a minute. So this was the last teeth piece that I made. And most of these were made not just by hand, but I would make a lot of meaning through the scatter and multiplying of this image and repeating it over and over and over again. So a lot of these pieces were scattered on the ground, different sizes, because I was interested in how the color affected the meaning, but then also like these were the same size, so small you could put them in your mouth like candy. It's too long an explanation, honestly, to explain exactly what spurred me on, but I decided in like around 98 that I wanted you to experience my work differently, that I wanted a discrete object with clear contour, very clear definition of it being a sculpture. So that if you found it on a garbage heap, you wouldn't think twice. You actually thought, oh, that's a sculpture. And I started in a very pragmatic way, quite honestly, because to make this kind of change, which for me, I felt was like a very, very big change in how I was going to create meaning. I spent at least a good year, 2 years where nothing came together.
Yeah.
At all. And I, at first, thought I was out of my mind to have embarked on this journey, and not sure I was going to be able to pull it together. And the first thing that clicked for me was when I made this first head, which was for the dog. And dog got remade 5 different times. Its first iteration was this aluminum bronze dog. And I wasn't quite happy with how the metal, I wasn't quite happy with what was matte, what was polished, how the animal and the human parts came together. So I took a mold off of the aluminum bronze dog and then changed it in the wax, which is an easy thing to do at the Foundry. So I was just working at the Foundry and altering parts of it. Didn't like how the arms worked the first time we cast it. So we cut the arms out like a 4th time. And I remade them again and then brought them back into the piece. And it's as you see it here. Yeah, contradiction is something that I've always embraced in my work. I like for things to either be simultaneously funny and deadly serious, or incredibly beautiful and incredibly ugly and disturbing at the same time.
I feel like that's particularly true of this body of work. I mean, there's almost a kind of self-ridicule that happens with the work. As beautiful as it is, the otter, I think, is a good example of that. It's like this kind of preposterous, thin, long thing, and the head just seems to be balancing on top of the body. And there's a kind of humor in this, but it does seem self-mocking to a certain extent. And do you feel that that's true? Is that where the humor lays?
I don't know about self-mocking. I think it's kind of pathetic in its gesture. Yes. I'm interested and got very interested as I was working on these pieces with how gesture and posture makes meaning. And I think it's very rich when I started doing things like, if you do this versus this versus this versus this, the meaning changes.
Yeah, dramatically. You mentioned the Foundry, and I'd like to just get your impressions about how you work at the Foundry. What kinds of adjustments do you make, and do you see that as a collaboration to a certain extent, or do you just see it as an opportunity to sort of see the work freshly, to see it through your own eyes in a fresh way?
That's an interesting question, but a difficult question. So this was also, Monkeys was part of the first body of work that I had cast. And I started bringing pieces to the Foundry in like about, I can't even remember whether it was 99 or 2000 or 2001. I don't really remember. I'm really pretty horrible about dates. But the first pieces that went through the process of having molds made, doing all the wax correcting, then watching it get invested, and then chased, put back together, particularly this piece. This piece is one where we never quite finished the edition, because each piece in the edition takes 1.5 years to make.
Oh my God.
And I thought if I do the entire edition, rather than just make them and sell them as we go through the edition, I will never make new work. And so there was that decision. There was a huge learning curve. I was very, very lucky that at Polish, and then it went to Polish Talix, there were a number of key people on the floor that I recognized were incredibly talented. There were people like Jerry Tobin, who's probably in his 70s now. And I thought, wow, this man knows so much about chasing and finishing and assembly. I'm going to be like a sponge and just soak it up, put my ego aside and try to learn from him. And he was very, very generous. And so we got a very close relationship. And then there was Vanessa Hoheb, who sort of knew every sort of phase of the process. And there were just so many people. They had a welder, Vinny, who has since moved on and opened his own foundry, and probably the best welder in the world. Just unbelievable. Well, so it's a complicated process. You can't be at odds because they're helping to translate your work.
Yeah. They
understood that I really wanted to be very, very hands-on involved, but I also couldn't be there because if I was going to be there every day in the process, I would still be working on the first body of work that I showed in like 2002.
Well, I do want to move on to some of your most recent work. And I think you mentioned that it's been possible for you to produce it entirely in your studio, which means you're sort of not relying on that outside professional, training. And
but I still need certain commercial machines that I don't have here. So I do have to bring things at different points to different places where I'm lucky they let me work with them. But they're more local.
Could you talk a little bit about your use of color? I mean, this has been you jumped in with both feet here. Tell me a little bit of, what attracts you to the resin, what attracts you to the color, how the color changes meaning for you, the intensity of color, the saturation, all of that.
This is an interesting thing because in hindsight, I understand now something that I didn't see until maybe 2 years into this. When I was a graduate student, I wanted to take painting and sculpture and make it come together and be totally wedded. And I failed miserably. And I got to the point where I realized there's convention in different mediums for a very specific reason. And when I started working with these resins and acrylic, I started realizing that some of the properties that existed when I was working in the metal actually kind of related to what I was now doing with the resin and acrylic, because I felt like the translucent versus the opaque was somewhat similar to certain characteristics that were in the metal. But with the introduction of color, which is, I think, something that took me a while to actually get a handle and to sort of really understand how to work with it and how it existed, what I can do with it that I could never do before when the material I was working with was opaque and monochromatic, or metal where it was the color of the metal.
Well, and it also creates an environment for the figures to be in, and that's a sometimes suffocating environment, sometimes it's elevating. And I find all that interesting, that the environment in the past was always the space it was placed in.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me because this is still so new to me, because I started this like in 2013. And that sounds like a long time ago, but for me, like any change I make, the first 2 years, I had nothing to show for it. And it takes a while for things to make sense, and I'm still trying to make sense of it now. And since the virus, I started trying to do certain things and work with another material that I hadn't worked with before with these materials that I'm showing you here. And I don't have any photographs of them, but there are aspects of it where I feel like I'm almost painting while I'm pouring the material. When I'm working on these pieces, I take, because my studio is no longer where I live, and I love my cell phone, I take photographs endlessly, bring them home, and I look at them at night. And so I have a record of these things and how they evolve. And if I showed you some of it, you would just go, you wouldn't believe that it started here and ended up where it winds up.
Well, before we go on too much further, I do want to get to Robert. So you'll have to stop your screen share, and Robert, you'll have to bring yours up. And then I think I'll probably return to a couple of questions at the very end. And if we've got time, we may end up taking a couple of questions from the audience, which looks like it's pretty big right now. So Robert, I've always felt like in your work, there has been this sort of everyman doppelganger, sort of Robert in many of your pieces. And I just, first of all, just was curious if you felt like he represented, the id you, the best or the worst of you, all the above.
You asked a while back about self-portraiture, and I started using myself as a matter of convenience, because I'm pretty private when I'm working. I don't, so I didn't want to model in the studio. I had been trained to draw from the model, so almost like a 19th century artist at Cooper. He did 8-hour drawing sessions the first year. But as I was making the transition to working figuratively, which was a long drawn out transition, I don't want to be unclear. I started, drawing again figuratively as soon as I left graduate school. And I put figurative elements into what were essentially abstract paintings. My first show included abstract frescoes that were abstract paintings and paintings with ears in them. But I slowly and gradually became more and more an overt figurative painter. And part of the process for me involved, well, I'd been taught to draw perceptually. I'd never been taught to paint perceptually, really. And so I began painting from objects in my studio. So some of the first things were buckets and ladders, and I had a clock, and I'm not sure if I have those on my website. I think I might. I don't know. I don't have those on the website. The black and white things.
You don't have any of them?
No, my website's very incomplete. You used one for the ad for this, for the posting for this. And I'd been working black and white for about 8 years. Then I started painting objects in my studio, trying to train myself, including buckets, the backs of paintings, ladders, things like that. And black and white was a useful imitation. And then I decided I wanted to paint a figure. And that one you used for the ad of the suit of armor holding a fire bucket was the second full figure painting I made as an adult. And what I did was go to the Met and start drawing from armor. I got the idea of doing a suit of armor because I was able to paint buckets, which are shiny and have seams. And I thought I could probably paint a suit of armor now. It was sort of pragmatic at first. Then I went to the Met, did research, drew from armor, went to their library, and I found that one is actually from another museum. I found a photograph of that suit of armor shot from behind, and I loved it because the ass was covered, which made it funny. The suit, if you look carefully, was empty, and that made it funny. And so I made a painting from it that was life size, which I think was the first full-scale figure painting I'd made in a long, long time.
Could you bring up the suit of armor with the naked guy from behind? Because that's one of my favorite pieces of yours. It's
So I painted that suit of armor, and then I put the bucket in his hand, because in the suit of armor hand, because I could paint the bucket. And I had these fire buckets, and I thought it made it funny and interesting. I also, you know, you're asking about self-portraiture. So I thought suit of armor is kind of a defensive mechanism. And it was something I identified with that way, feeling defensive, but also like a failed defense because it was empty, the suit of armor, and staring out into nothingness. And I thought it'd be interesting to be a little more overt about it. So I decided I would take the same pose as I was switching to color and make a painting of myself. And this is life size. The underwear happened in that painting because of an accident. I had worked on this painting for 8 or 9 months, and it was hard for me to revise a lot. And I was standing on a box in front of it, painting a part of it, and I spilled paint on it that got onto the ass. And so I didn't want to throw the painting away. I'd gotten just below the ass, and I couldn't take it off, but I could cover it up. So that's how the underwear came in at first. And I made a bunch of studies, I think those might be here, on the way to that, of drop pants and underwear, you know, stuff like that. It led to a bunch of things. Some of these I thought, at times I can't tell what are going to be studies and what are going to be paintings. So, you know, covering the ass and the drop pants and the socks on the floor were the last thing I figured out, that because I thought that was funny also. Was really interesting to me, and that sense of a state of emergency and not being up to it. And also the bucket is empty, all those kind of, I work a long time on paintings. And so across time, I get a lot of ideas about what they're about. Even back then when I was doing a number of things sort of simply pragmatically, and that led to putting the clock in. I had painted the clock like 2 years before, so I knew I could do it. So I stuck the clock in. I like that the bucket, I like that the bucket on the floor says I, or that really made me interested. I was interested in that.
Can I ask you why you don't paint environments really? There's a suggestion of space, clock's got to be hanging on something, so presumably there's a wall there, but you don't really paint the wall. And I wonder, is that to keep it in a more iconic condition, or do you feel like those kinds of details just aren't what the painting is about?
Yeah, because, while at this point, I was trying to keep my proportions accurate and all that stuff, and trying to keep it the figure kind of naturalistic. I wasn't interested in it being like a real place at all. For me, I was much more interested in metaphoric readings. And so in a funny way, by not specifying and making the space ambiguous, it's actually, the space is sort of the space of seamless backdrop.
Yeah.
Like fashion photography and product photography. Right. And at one point I thought, I didn't do this from the beginning, I didn't think this from the beginning. I thought that's kind of like the holiest space we lived with then. It was like a religious space was that commercial space, beautiful and empty somehow. So that didn't occur to me, but again, across time, these things occurred to me.
Well, it's where the object is at its best, right? There's no distraction from the object.
Yeah, and I'm interested in multiple readings, so that in a funny way, if it were in a naturalistic environment. Later on, photographs moved to me there's stuff in my studio, kind of. Let me see, these paintings have a tiny bit more context, I mean, not a whole lot.
Can I ask you, your every man has been clubbed, torn apart, put back together, but backwards, dressed only in half in armor. Does he ever get a break? He's sort of, he's so woebegone.
Yeah, he's also the really aggressive at failing at it, and also like for me, like Rona, I think some of the things we share, although we're very different people, are liking things that seem both serious and not. And I there's a kind of humor that I like very much that in some ways I think of as maybe Eastern European, that's dark just because of history and stuff, and skeptical. And again, I have hindsight now. So for me, I see these things, and even at the time I made them, I thought a painting like the one that's on the screen now really was both personal, but also reflective of a larger political situation in the world. Of, that figure in the center, which is kind of a Bacchus figure, is holding up grapes, which is a sign of excess for Bacchus and sort of ecstasy. And he's being guarded by, me fat kind of, and threatening, but not very effectively, and I think these paintings were made in the Bush years, I'm not sure. And I'm not saying my references were, straightforwardly political or anything like that, but I do think I have a kind of skepticism about authority and power that shows up in these things. And so when there's references to mythological stuff, I often think it's in a way that I both identify with some of the desires in these things, which are not socially acceptable, but I also identify with the failure in them. And so.
Well, one more thing about the most recent work. This is just my reading, but it's like your figures have finally gone to heaven, but they're still upside down. They're still awkward. They're still somehow humiliated, not blessed. It's again, this guy just never gets a break. It's like even when he gets to heaven, it's still, he's going to be humiliated by it somehow.
Yeah. I don't know. For me, laughter is a way to get through things. It's a way, it's a defense that works some of the time, and it's a way to help get through things. And for me, also laughter in a funny way undercuts authority in interesting ways. Again, there's a lot of stuff that now I see, having worked for years, that I may not have seen in process. Although I also, I grew up in a family that was fairly literary. Both my parents were trained to be English teachers, though my father may have been trained to be a history teacher. My mother taught English. Everyone read in the house. Language meant a lot. And so I often have not elaborate literary ideas, but somewhat literary ideas when I start. And as I make a lot of drawings towards a painting, I'm like a 15th century painter in the sense that I make 15 or 20 drawings towards a painting, often the same size as the painting. And I start by transferring a drawing to the painting. That's the first thing I do when I start a painting. And by the time I started this painting, which is called Over the Hill, the title had occurred to me. And as I get older, occasionally I'll hear a phrase or something and say, that would make a great painting, just from the phrase, without having any idea what the image should be like, But so, and I thought about Icarus and Daedalus while I was making this too, but I thought about my own mortality. Yeah. But you also look, the figure's really, really monumental here, which is ridiculous. If you look at the scale of the landscape to the figure, it's really preposterous. And I like that. We're very lucky. We travel a lot in the summer with Antonio Homem from Sonnabend, and we started looking at Spanish Gothic painting years ago, and it's very underknown around the world. And there's a way in which Northern naturalism shows up in Spain, but gets extremely distorted towards expressive ends, you know, because it's a different culture. So there are elements of naturalism, but also elements of what I would call caricature. And you know, there are tons of, if you look through historical painting, there are tons of images of the ascension, of Mary going to heaven or Jesus going to heaven with their feet sticking out of the clouds. And I thought, what would happen if I turned that upside down? That was the first way I started these paintings. But I had also, you know, in the 90s, these go back, I think.
Yeah, some of the earliest
I
pieces, right?
mean, this is, I don't remember what year this is, but this is called Saint. And those are my feet. And I, you know, wanted to make this painting, but I also thought about the level of my own suffering in the world. And you have to suffer to be a saint. And so I put a Band-Aid on the toe because I was thinking about the level of my own suffering, which was
Minimal.
relatively, I mean, comparatively speaking, not so bad, you know.
Not so bad.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned literary references earlier, and I wonder if you also feel that there's a kind of theatrical reference, that feels like there are props, you know, there's a cast of characters, you know, that it feels like there's almost a stage in a weird way at times.
You know, it's interesting. That's interesting to me too, because it partially happened for me reusing objects. I mean, because, you know, I started with a galvanized bucket I had in my studio. The clock that's in this painting was our alarm clock for years. And I went out and bought a fire bucket because I thought the challenge of getting the letters on the bucket would be interesting. And then once I started painting in color, I stuck it in a painting because I wanted red in a painting. It started sometimes that simply, but then you use it, you work on it for 5 months and you get other ideas, and then you use it a second time and it starts to seem a little like iconography, although I don't want it meaning fixed. I mean, one of the things I love though is that people do seem to want to interpret my work when I have exhibitions, and they talk to me about it. And they're rarely the same what people say, but you know, they're also never wrong sounding to me. I mean, you know, the club has been in my painting for a lifetime.
Yeah.
I stuck the crutch. Rona talks about looking at sculpture. So we were at the Archaeological Museum in Naples, and I saw the great Hercules there. And from having looked for years at sculpture with Rona, at small bronzes and being interested in how they were made, when first neither of us could look at those things because we were still coming out of abstraction in some ways, but looking across years. And you know, it's this massive Hercules, and Hercules is often showing leaning on a tree stump with the lion's skin on it. But as Rona had taught me, that's also so the fucking sculpture can stand.
So it can work.
No, because there's a hole between the tree stump and him, and his legs are crossed in the sculpture, you know, and he's like at rest leaning on it. And I thought it would be funny for the support to be a crutch. It was sort of that simple thing was the first way I thought of it. That's why I stuck the crutch in the painting instead of a tree stump, you know. So
it also reminds me of, you know, some of Dali's crutches. And there's been that surrealist trope for quite a long time too. I like this one with the multiple crutches. It just looks like, you know, the entire body can't exist without, you know, this external support system.
I had to go out and buy crutches. Yeah, I had to go out and buy a bunch of crutches.
Well, can I ask you guys one more question just about your lives together?
Your emails are on the screen and your website is very small.
Oh,
There we go.
okay.
Can you
Thank you.
can you make that full screen?
It is full screen now.
Now it is.
I have all your, somehow my emails are on. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, well, we're old.
I didn't touch anything. It just all of a sudden did it.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that you've collected, you were talking about 16th and 15th century prints. I wonder, do you collect any of your contemporaries? Do you trade with your friends? And have you made some trades that you didn't agree on? Or do you always have to have a consensus in order to have it be a part of your collection?
Most of our collecting really has focused on prints from the time we were in our 20s. And we tended to buy things that interested one or both of us so that we can live with things that we want to steal from.
You know what, it's not like we buy them knowing we love them, and we don't do it separately. We always have to reach agreement to buy something, but sometimes it takes me a year or two to realize why I bought the thing, and for it to have an effect. And living, that's a great thing about living with things. And then we have friends that we have gifts from across the years and stuff. We have work by other people too.
And we've also given work to other friends. So
Yeah. It's part of being an artist. I feel like at the very least, every artist should have a great collection at the end of their life. You know, the one thing you can do is trade.
I don't know about you, Peter, but we painfully decide every acquisition that we bring in, and I have the Redon prints here in my office, at my studio, and there was a long discussion. Is it okay if I take the Redons? I want them. And because it sort of felt for me like as I've been working, they seem to be having more and more an influence on my work. And I think when we first bought them, they had more of an influence on Robert's work.
Huh.
And then
because I use iconography, that, you know, I use stuff from, you know, mythological iconography, and we have bought a number of things that have some of that. But
we bought a number of skeletal prints, and each time we bought them, a disaster would happen. And I said to Robert, no more death imagery.
But you're getting a sign there, I think.
Yes, yes.
Well, I want to ask you both one last question, then there's a couple of questions in the chat that I'd like to get to. You've both taught at different times. Robert, I believe you retired just a couple of years ago. And I just wanted to get a feeling for how teaching affected your studio practice and your thinking as a creative person.
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, because you and I taught and had to form a course together, I feel like our weekly lunch conversations had a big impact on me.
Yeah, me too.
And I felt like the students in the senior year at Parsons helped me understand how another generation thought, looked, what made them tick, because I realized I didn't think that way. I didn't look that way anymore. I'm sure, and I don't even remember when I stopped teaching, but it was a really long time ago. I'm sure every time I talk to a student now, I have no clue what makes them tick.
Just because you haven't had the constant contact?
And conversations, no. And so I think whether it's good or bad, I live in my own bubble, except for Robert. That's what's interesting. We really are each other's worlds, even though we have lots of friends that are artists and we love their work. The conversations are not as deep and ongoing. We wake up in the morning and we're talking about art over breakfast. I come home, we're talking about art over dinner until we go to sleep. And then we stupidly turn on the TV and go to politics and get depressed. But we really obsessively talk about ideas or what we see and what our responses are and what we think about what we read recently and share with each other.
Yeah, I remember you loved biographies. You're a real biography fiend.
I still am.
Good for you.
And
Robert,
Robert doesn't need to read the book because I always read the most important sections to him.
you're gonna love this, honey. Robert, how about you? What made you decide to end your teaching?
You know, I mean, I taught since 1976
Oh my God, wow.
at one place. I got a job. I was waiting for Rona to finish graduate school because she was a year behind me. And I went in after the first year. I was a 1-year replacement and asked them to fire me so that I could get unemployment when we moved to New York. That was our only financial plan. I mean, we had no money and we were going to move to New York, which was possible then. And they luckily said we'd like to keep a relationship. So I commuted to Maine till 2018 for 17 weeks a year.
Wow.
At first, I lived up there for 3 or 4 months a year, a little bit for a while till I could afford to commute. They were very, very good to me. And I was really lucky. And it was a small liberal arts school. And I taught, you know, smart, interesting kids. And it was a small place. So I got to know most of the students I taught. I mean, when I was in process, there were a lot of years where, you know, I wished I weren't doing it, but then with hindsight, there are aspects of it I missed too, because the contact with young, smart people was interesting. And also the vicarious part of it, because I didn't want kids to work like I do in any way. And, but so I would say, boy, if I was making work, I ended up mostly doing senior thesis work with them, teaching drawing from the model and senior thesis work and a few other things. And I would get to think, boy, if I made work like that, what would I have to think about? You know, what would I have to think about to make it better? Or what kinds of things might I be thinking about? And it turns out smart kids that work hard can make interesting work. So with hindsight, a lot of it was fun. And also I was lucky to be out of the ecosystem of adjunct work in New York because I was paid very well for this. It made a lot of things possible for us. We were very, very lucky about it.
Well, it certainly was easier to move to New York in the 70s. It was, you could get big places for next to nothing. But, you know, this hour just disappeared. I wanted to get to a couple of the chat questions, but I actually have a hard stop at 3. So I may end up sending the questions on to you. And if you choose to, you can answer them. I think some of them may even be your family members too. But I want to thank you both for being so honest and generous with your time and with your work and just giving us insights into your studio practice. It's really been a lot of fun for me, and I knew it was going to be, but I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for doing it, Peter.
Well, we'll have to do it again. I'll have to have both you guys come to the school and do some crits if you can be convinced.
Sure.
Once it's healthy enough to have visitors on board.
Sounds good.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you, Noel, for putting this together. And thank you to the audience, which I think got up into the 70s or 80s today. So we have all the rest of our upcoming lectures and panel discussions are on our website. So please do go there and we'll see you in the future. Okay, bye.